This is the dark story of Unit 731 of China and Southeast Asia, the secret weapons program that turned thousands of living people into logs, whose doctors weaponized the plague, then walked away as free men. Its official name was designed to sound harmless: the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. But behind the sterile name, it was a factory of nightmares, a place where science was used to commit acts of pure evil. Our story begins not with a building, but with a man, a brilliant and ruthless army doctor named Shirō Ishii. Born in 1892, he graduated from Kyoto Imperial University. He was considered a genius, but also arrogant and strange. He quickly joined the Imperial Japanese Army as a surgeon. But Ishii wasn't interested in saving lives. He was fascinated by the deadliest microorganisms on Earth. He believed they were the future of warfare. In 1928, he began a 2-year tour of the West, studying biological weapons programs in Europe and the US. He saw the potential for a new kind of weapon, one that could wipe out entire populations silently. Ishii returned to Japan with a terrifying vision. He lobbied aggressively within the highest ranks of the military, arguing that a bioweapons program was essential for the empire. His most influential patron was the Minister of the Army, Sadao Araki. The timing for his ambition was perfect. In 1931, the Japanese Guandong Army invaded Manchuria, a vast and resource-rich territory in northeastern China. They established a puppet state called Manchukuo. This remote, lawless, and occupied land was the perfect place for Ishii to build his secret laboratory. Far from the prying eyes of Tokyo, and far from the international community, he was promoted and given command of a new unit, the Army Epidemic Prevention Research Laboratory. In 1932, he was granted authority to begin his work in Manchuria. He established a small, preliminary facility, a prototype prison lab called the Zhoma Fortress. Here, the first horrific experiments began on a small scale, proving Ishii's brutal methods could yield results. But Ishii's ambition was much grander. He envisioned a massive, state-of-the-art research city, a place where he could produce bioweapons on an industrial scale. He used charm and political maneuvering to get his funding. He even fabricated local plague outbreaks to prove the need. His superiors gave him an almost unlimited budget. And that is where the timeline fractured. In 1936, by order of Emperor Hirohito himself, the unit was expanded. Construction began on a sprawling compound in the Pingfang district, just 24 kilometers south of the major city of Harbin. This new facility was enormous, covering 6 square kilometers. A city dedicated to death, with over 150 buildings. It had administrative blocks, advanced laboratories, and operating theaters. There were barracks for the thousands of staff, even a Shinto shrine, a movie theater, and brothels. It had its own power plant, an airfield, and a fleet of planes. A railway line connected it directly to the occupied territory. At its center was the main laboratory building, a massive structure. It was designed to be inescapable and completely secret, surrounded by high walls, electrified fences, and armed guards. The local Chinese population was told it was a lumber mill. In a way, that wasn't entirely a lie. Shirō Ishii, the architect of this evil, now had his kingdom, a state-of-the-art facility, the full backing of the military, and a captive population to draw from. All he needed now were the raw materials for his experiments. He needed the logs for his mill. As we dive deeper into this lost, dark history story, please subscribe to my channel, Faded Footprints. So, with the Pingfang complex completed, General Ishii needed a constant supply of human test subjects. He made it clear to the Guandong Army's military police, the Kenpitai, that prisoners were his special material. They were not to be executed or interrogated to death. Instead, anyone deemed an enemy of the empire was rounded up. This included Chinese resistance fighters, suspected spies, common criminals, and captured Soviet soldiers. But it also extended to ordinary civilians. Intellectuals, political dissidents, and even women and children were taken. They were secretly transported to Unit 731, usually by train under cover of darkness. Upon arrival, they were stripped of their names, their pasts, and their identities. Each person was assigned a numerical designation, like Maryuta 101 or Maryuta 203. Maryuta was the code name used by the staff. It means logs in Japanese. This dehumanizing term reflected the absolute lack of respect for their lives. To the scientists, these were not people. They were mere raw materials for their research. Pieces of wood to be used and then discarded. The Maryuta were housed in specially constructed prison blocks within the compound. These were stark, concrete cells with a single viewing hole in the steel door. Guards would peer through, monitoring the subjects at all times. Ironically, the prisoners were generally well-fed and kept in relatively healthy conditions. They were given meals of rice or sorghum, and sometimes even fruit. This was not out of any compassion. It was for purely scientific reasons. A healthy, well-nourished test subject provided a cleaner baseline for experiments. The scientists wanted to observe the pure effects of diseases, not complications from malnutrition. The staff of Unit 731 included thousands of individuals, a cross-section of Japan's scientific elite. There were elite medical researchers, bacteriologists, surgeons, and pathologists. Many were recruited from the top universities in Japan, promised unlimited resources and the chance to conduct groundbreaking research. Below them were technicians, guards, and administrative personnel, all sworn to absolute secrecy. They were organized into various divisions, each with its own horrific specialty. The first division focused on bacterial research, studying the effects of plague, cholera, anthrax, and typhoid on living humans. The second division concentrated on developing biological weapons. They designed bombs, artillery shells, and other methods for delivering the diseases. The third division was responsible for producing plague-infested fleas on an industrial scale. The fourth division produced vast quantities of other deadly bacteria. Other divisions handled supply, training, and the grim task of disposing of the bodies in incinerators. General Ishii himself was known for his eccentric and often brutal leadership. He was brilliant but had an unpredictable temper. He would often host lavish parties for his staff, complete with sake and geishas, all just yards away from where the atrocities were being committed. He enforced a culture of absolute secrecy and ruthlessness. Any staff member who spoke out, or who showed too much compassion for the Maryuta, risked severe punishment, even death. This created an environment where monstrous acts became routine, a part of a day's work. The research conducted within Unit 731 was incredibly meticulous. Every experiment was documented in detail with notes and photographs. The goal was to collect data that no other country in the world possessed, data on how diseases affected the human body in real time. And these experiments were about to begin. The Maryuta were led from their cells, often in groups, into the gleaming white laboratories. They would be strapped to operating tables or led to outdoor testing grounds, unaware that they were about to become living subjects in the most depraved medical experiments ever conceived. The experiments conducted at Unit 731 are almost too evil to comprehend. They represent the darkest extreme of human cruelty, all under the guise of scientific inquiry. The victims, the Maryuta, faced agonizing deaths that were meticulously documented. One of the most horrifying practices was vivisection. This involved performing surgical dissections on living people without anesthesia. Scientists would infect a prisoner with a disease, like the bubonic plague, cholera, or syphilis. Then, at various stages of the disease's progression, they would cut them open while they were still alive and conscious. Their organs would be removed and examined to see the real-time effects of the infection on the body's tissues and systems. The rationale was chillingly pragmatic. They believed if the subject was anesthetized, the drugs might interfere with the results. So, the prisoners endured unimaginable pain, their screams echoing in the sterile labs. Another area of brutal research involved frostbite. Japanese forces often operated in the freezing Manchurian winters. Ishii's team wanted to understand how to prevent and treat severe cold injuries. Prisoners were taken outside into temperatures as low as -20 degrees Celsius. They were forced to dip their bare arms and legs into barrels of freezing water, or they were exposed to powerful fans until their limbs were frozen solid. To gauge the severity of the frostbite, a guard would then strike the frozen limb with a wooden cane. The sound it made, described by a former Unit 731 member, was like a block of wood breaking. They then experimented with various methods of rewarming the limbs. Some were plunged into boiling water, others were treated with chemicals, and some were simply left to thaw, often resulting in gangrene and amputation. The researchers also conducted gruesome tests on human endurance and physiological limits. Prisoners were placed in high-pressure chambers. The air pressure would be slowly increased until their eyeballs literally burst from their sockets. Others were subjected to starvation experiments, locked in cells without food or water to determine the exact time it would take for a human to die. They studied the effects of dehydration, air embolisms, and blood loss. And right there, the normal part ends. The researchers also performed surgical experiments. They would amputate limbs from living subjects to study blood loss. They would then reattach the limbs to different parts of the body, just to observe the healing process. Sometimes, organs like the stomach or liver would be surgically removed. The esophagus would then be reattached directly to the intestines, to study how the body would function without vital digestive organs. Women prisoners were subjected to forced pregnancies and then vivisected, to study how diseases affected the fetus. Others were infected with syphilis and gonorrhea and forced to rape male prisoners to study how the diseases spread. Children were not exempt. Records indicate that some of the Maryuta were as young as 4 years old. They were subjected to similar cruelties, from vivisections to bacterial infections, all in the name of science. When prisoners became too weak from the experiments, or when their organs were too damaged to provide clean data, they were simply killed. Often, this was done by lethal injection, or they were sent to the incinerator. The precision of the cruelty was systematic. Every grim detail, every agonizing death, every change in the body was meticulously recorded in scientific journals, photographed, and sometimes even filmed. This was not science aimed at saving lives. It was a production line of agony, a vast, hidden atrocity committed under the orders of General Shirō Ishii and with the full knowledge of the Japanese High Command. While the labs inside were a theater of medical horror, the fields outside the Pingfong facility were for a different kind of evil. This was where Unit 731 tested its conventional weapons, not on dummies or animals, but on living human targets. The goal was to gather precise data on the effectiveness of their arsenal, to understand the exact damage each weapon could inflict on the human body. Prisoners, the Maryuta, were taken from their cells to an open proving ground. They were tied to thick wooden stakes, arranged in rows at varying distances. Sometimes they were forced to wear thick protective gear. Other times, they were left completely exposed. Japanese planes would then fly low overhead. They dropped newly designed bombs to test their fragmentation patterns. After the explosions, doctors and researchers would rush onto the field. They didn't go to help the wounded. They went to observe the types of injuries, to measure the depth of shrapnel wounds, to see how long it took for the victims to bleed out. They tested chemical weapons in the same horrific manner. Prisoners were tied to stakes or forced into sealed chambers. Then, canisters of poison gas were released. Researchers, protected in gas masks, would watch through glass windows. They timed, with stopwatches, how long it took for the gas to kill, noting the horrific effects on the subject's lungs and skin. They also tested flamethrowers. A soldier would walk down a line of tied prisoners and incinerate them one by one. The scientists would study the severity of the burns and determine the weapon's efficiency. Grenades were tested by having prisoners stand in a circle around one. Sometimes, they were forced to lie down with the grenade on their stomach. The researchers wanted to see the blast effects at point-blank range. The cruelty was not random, it was systematic. Every detail was designed to extract the maximum amount of data. Even the placement of the stakes was calculated, to understand how a single bomb could kill or maim the most people. But these tests were only a prelude. The ultimate goal of Unit 731 was far more ambitious. It was to perfect the weapons for their new form of warfare. And that's when the shadows began to move. They began combining their research, using the weapons tests to deliver their deadliest creations. Planes flew over the proving grounds, but instead of conventional bombs, they dropped ceramic shells filled not with explosives, but with millions of plague-infested fleas. The bombs would shatter on impact, releasing the insects over the tied prisoners. The researchers would then observe the Maryuta for days, watching as they developed the telltale signs of the bubonic plague: high fevers, swollen lymph nodes, and agonizing pain. They documented the exact time from exposure to sickness and from sickness to death. This was the core of Shirō Ishii's vision: the marriage of conventional weapons and deadly pathogens, creating a silent, invisible killer that could be deployed on a massive scale. One that could wipe out an entire city without firing a single shot. The fields of Pingfong were a laboratory for mass destruction, and the lessons learned there were about to be unleashed on the world outside. The experiments at Pingfong were only the first step. General Ishii's ultimate goal was mass production. He wanted to create an arsenal of biological weapons, enough to wage a new and terrible kind of war. Unit 731 was not just a lab, it was a factory, and its main product was the bubonic plague. The 4th Division was responsible for this grim task. They developed a highly efficient system for breeding rats. Thousands of them were kept in cages, fed, and cared for. These rats were the hosts for the next stage of production. Fleas. The researchers would infest the healthy rats with plague-carrying fleas. Once the rats were thoroughly infested, they would be injected with the plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis. The rats would sicken and die in a matter of days. As their bodies grew cold, the fleas would seek a new, warm host. The scientists designed special containers to collect them. The dead rats were placed in a drum over a layer of water. As the fleas jumped off, they would fall and be trapped. They were then harvested by the millions. This flea factory could produce tens of millions of insects for a single campaign. But fleas were just the delivery system. The real weapon was the bacteria itself. Unit 731 cultivated dozens of the world's deadliest pathogens. They had vast stockpiles of anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. They worked to create more virulent strains of these diseases. Through selective breeding and animal testing, they wanted to make the diseases more contagious, more lethal, and more resistant to treatment. To produce the bacteria on a massive scale, they used large, industrial vats. They would fill these containers with a nutrient broth, then introduce a small sample of the bacteria. In the warm, nutrient-rich environment, the bacteria would multiply at an explosive rate. They could produce enough cholera bacteria to contaminate a city's water supply in just a few days. And that's when the official record begins to unravel. The next challenge was how to deliver these weapons to the enemy. The 2nd Division worked tirelessly on this problem. They developed a variety of bombs designed not to explode violently, but to shatter on impact, dispersing their deadly contents. The most infamous of these was the UG bomb, a ceramic shell that was cheap to produce and did not burn its contents. It was a fragile clay pot, filled with plague-infested fleas or bacteria. When dropped from a plane, it would crack open like an egg, releasing its payload over a wide area. They also developed methods to contaminate food and water supplies. They mixed anthrax into cookies and infected wells with cholera and typhoid, creating poison teams that could infiltrate enemy territory and spread disease silently among the civilian population. The scientists of Unit 731 were proud of their work. They saw themselves as patriots, creating a superweapon for their emperor. They had perfected their methods of production. They had designed their delivery systems. Now, all that was left was to unleash their silent killers on the unsuspecting people of China. The horrors of Unit 731 were not confined to the walls of the Pingfong facility. The ultimate purpose of the program was to test its weapons in the real world, against the civilian population of China. Starting in the late 1930s, the Imperial Japanese Army began a series of horrifying field tests. These were not simulations. They were deliberate acts of biological warfare. One of the first major attacks occurred in 1940. Japanese planes flew over the city of Ningbo, a busy port south of Shanghai. They didn't drop explosive bombs. Instead, they released ceramic uji bombs filled with plague-infested fleas. The bombs shattered in the streets, releasing their deadly cargo. Local Chinese residents, unaware of the danger, were bitten. Within days, the bubonic plague began to spread through the city. Hospitals were overwhelmed. People died in agony in their homes and on the streets. The attack on Ningbo killed thousands of innocent civilians, and it proved to Ishii that his weapons worked exactly as planned. This was just the beginning. In 1941, a similar attack was launched on the city of Changde. Again, planes dropped fleas carrying the plague. The resulting outbreak was catastrophic, claiming thousands more lives. The Japanese Army also used more direct methods of contamination. Special teams from Unit 731 would infiltrate Chinese towns and villages. They would approach wells, the primary source of drinking water for the community. Under the cover of night, they would dump vials of cholera and typhoid bacteria into the water. The results were devastating. Entire communities were wiped out by uncontrollable outbreaks of dysentery and cholera. They also contaminated food supplies, distributing poisoned buns and crackers to children and prisoners of war. These items were laced with anthrax and other deadly pathogens. The cruelty was calculated and indiscriminate. The goal was not just to kill, but to create terror and social chaos, to destabilize entire regions and break the will of the Chinese resistance. One of the most diabolical plans was never fully realized. It was called Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. The plan was to use long-range submarines and seaplanes to launch a massive biological attack on the United States, specifically on the civilian population of Southern California. They planned to drop Uji bombs filled with plague-infested fleas over cities like San Diego. The attack was scheduled for September 22, 1945. It was only called off because of Japan's surrender just weeks before it was set to launch. And that's when the truth had its own story to tell. The actions of Unit 731 were not isolated experiments. They were a key part of Japan's war strategy in China, constituting one of the largest and most horrific uses of biological weapons in human history. The exact number of victims is impossible to know for sure, but conservative estimates suggest that the plague attacks alone killed tens of thousands of people. When you include the deaths from cholera, typhoid, and other diseases, the total number of victims is likely in the hundreds of thousands. These were not soldiers. They were men, women, and children deliberately targeted with invisible weapons. Their deaths were a direct result of the work done in Shirō Ishii's labs, the final, brutal field test of his factory of nightmares. The continuation dark story of Unit 731 of China. For years, the horrors of Unit 731 remained a closely guarded secret. But in the summer of 1945, the Empire of Japan was collapsing. Germany had surrendered, and the Allied forces were closing in. The end of the war was imminent. On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union launched a massive, surprise invasion of Manchuria. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers swept across the border, rapidly overwhelming the Japanese Guandong Army. For General Shirō Ishii and the staff at the Pingfang facility, this was the ultimate emergency. The Red Army was advancing directly towards them. If the facility was captured, the world would learn of their horrific experiments, and the staff would be tried as war criminals. Ishii immediately received orders from Imperial General Headquarters. The directive was simple and brutal: leave no trace. A frantic and systematic cover-up began. The first priority was to destroy the evidence. Unit 731 staff ran through the labs, gathering every incriminating document: research notes, experiment logs, photographs, and autopsy reports. They burned everything in massive bonfires that raged for days. Next, they had to destroy the facility itself. Engineers planted explosives throughout the main laboratory buildings. On the night of August 13th, a series of huge explosions rocked the compound. The buildings where the worst atrocities had taken place were reduced to rubble. They also had to eliminate their stockpiles of biological weapons. They dumped tons of bacteria and infected materials into the nearby rivers. This caused a final, parting plague outbreak that killed thousands of local Chinese civilians. But there was one final, horrifying piece of evidence to erase: the remaining prisoners, the last surviving Maryuta. These men and women were the last living witnesses to the unit's crimes. They could not be allowed to be captured alive by the Soviets. And that's where the light ends, and our story truly begins. The guards went to the prison blocks. They told the prisoners they were being released, and that they would be given a final farewell meal and drinks. The food and water were laced with cyanide. Those who didn't die from the poison were shot or gassed in their cells. Every single remaining prisoner was murdered in cold blood. Their bodies were thrown into pits or burned in the incinerators. Once the evidence was destroyed and the witnesses were silenced, the staff of Unit 731 prepared to flee. Ishii gathered his remaining personnel for a final, chilling speech. He ordered them to keep the unit's secrets to their graves. He told them not to take any prominent public or government positions after the war, and he distributed vials of potassium cyanide to his top researchers, instructing them to commit suicide if they were about to be captured. Then, they boarded the last trains out of Harbin, scattering across Japan, hoping to disappear into the chaos of the post-war country. General Shirō Ishii himself faked his own death. He staged a mock funeral in his hometown to throw off Allied investigators. He and his top lieutenants went into hiding. believing they had successfully buried their crimes beneath the rubble of their labs and erased their sins with the ashes of their victims. But they held one last, valuable secret: the very data they had worked so hard to destroy. At the end of this video, I will show you guys the real pictures of this dark, evil history, and even how one of the room where there keeps people looks like. The war was over. The world began to uncover the full extent of the atrocities committed. The call for justice was deafening. The Nuremberg and Tokyo trials were convened to prosecute were criminals. The men of Unit 731 should have been first in line. What happened next is one of the greatest injustices of the 20th century. This story that was deliberately hidden from the world for decades. This channel, Faded Footprints, exists to tell the world these dark truths and to ensure the victims are not forgotten. If you believe these stories must be told, please take a moment now to subscribe and like this video. Your support allows us to continue this mission. General Shirō Ishii and his top researchers were eventually tracked down by American occupation forces. But instead of a trial, a secret deal was struck. The United States was intensely interested in the biological warfare data collected by Ishii's unit. No other country in the world possessed such extensive human experimentation data. It was considered invaluable for developing America's own bioweapons program, a program for the emerging Cold War. In exchange for this research, the United States granted Ishii and his entire staff full immunity from prosecution. They would never face charges for their horrific crimes. The decision was made by General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers in Japan. He believed the intelligence value of Ishii's data outweighed the need for justice. The deal was kept secret for decades. The monsters of Unit 731 were never punished. General Shirō Ishii, the architect of this evil, lived until 1959. He died of natural causes at the age of 67, never facing a single day in court. Many of his top researchers went on to have long, successful careers in Japan. Dr. Masaji Kitano became a prominent pharmaceutical executive. Dr. Ryoichi Nato founded Japan's largest blood bank, Green Cross. Other former Unit 731 doctors became respected surgeons, medical school deans, and heads of hospitals. They died as old, respected men in Japanese society. Their victims, the Maryuta, were given no justice. Their stories were buried for decades under layers of secrecy and denial. For many years, the Japanese government officially denied the existence of Unit 731. It wasn't until the 1980s that the truth began to surface, largely due to the work of persistent historians. In 1997, a Japanese court finally acknowledged the existence of Unit 731 and its biological warfare activities. But the Japanese government has never offered a formal apology to the victims. Today, the ruins of the Pingfang facility in China stand as a museum, a stark memorial to the thousands who died in agony. Their names mostly unknown, their suffering unpunished. Unit 731 remains a permanent, chilling stain on the soul of history. A warning about what can happen when science is divorced from humanity, and when the pursuit of power outweighs the call for justice. The Japanese microbiologist Dr. Shirō Ishii, head of Unit 731. The Unit 731 building then. The Unit 731 building now. Children used for disease testing. Some of the adult test subjects. Some Unit 731 staff members. A kid been experimented on. This is Dr. Shirō checking one of the unalived man. This is how one of the room there keep people looks like. I think I have tried with this research, so please subscribe for more history stories like this.